in 1945 stood on the ruins of devastation. Cities lay in ashes, millions were dead, and humanity longed for peace. The horrors of World War II had shaken civilization to its core. As the smoke cleared, leaders realized that survival demanded cooperation, not conquest. Out of that wreckage came a vision, a new organization to prevent another global tragedy. It was here that the idea of the United Nations took form, built not on empire or power, but on unity and hope. October 24 would later mark United Nations Day, a symbol of rebirth after the darkest age. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 wasn't merely political, it was moral, a promise that humanity could rise again and build a better, safer world. Before the United Nations, there was the League of Nations, a noble but flawed attempt to preserve peace after World War I. Born from idealism, the League lacked power, unity, and global participation. When fascism rose in Europe and Asia, it failed to act decisively. The world watched helplessly as aggression consumed nations. Yet from this failure came valuable lessons. By 1945, leaders like Roosevelt and Churchill understood that any new organization had to be stronger, more inclusive, and backed by real authority. The history of the United Nations began with that reflection, a resolve to avoid the mistakes of the past and to create a new order that could stand firm against tyranny and war. In April 1945, as the final battles of the war raged, representatives from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco. It was one of the most ambitious diplomatic meetings in history. Their mission was to draft the UN Charter, a blueprint for a new era of peace. The mood was solemn, yet hopeful. The ghosts of war haunted every delegate, but the dream of unity drove them forward. Over weeks of negotiation, they debated the structure of the United Nations, its powers and responsibilities. On June 26, 1945, the UN Charter was signed, an act that would redefine the post-World War II world. Humanity, scarred but not defeated, had chosen dialogue over destruction.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt had long dreamed of a united world. Even before the war ended, he envisioned a global council where nations could resolve disputes through diplomacy. His idea of the United Nations was first used during the war to describe the Allied powers. But after victory, Roosevelt wanted it to become more than a military alliance. He wanted it to be humanity's moral alliance. Although he did not live to see the first meeting in San Francisco, his vision shaped its foundation. The United Nations 1945 became a living testament to his belief that lasting peace required justice, cooperation, and the courage to stand together as one world. "50 nations signed the UN Charter in June 1945, but their voices carried the hopes of a shattered world. From the great powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and France, to smaller countries newly freed from colonial rule, each delegate came with a dream of peace. The history of the United Nations began not in luxury, but in sacrifice. They had all suffered loss, witnessed destruction, and understood the cost of division. Their signatures in San Francisco represented more than diplomacy. They marked a collective promise to protect future generations from the scourge of war. This was the first time in history that so many nations stood together to build a shared system for global peace. On October 24, 1945, the United Nations Charter officially came into force after being ratified by the major powers. That date became United Nations Day, celebrated worldwide as the moment humanity began to rebuild not just nations, but trust. For the first time, the world had a platform where diplomacy could triumph over destruction. The Charter's preamble echoed a profound promise to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It was more than legal text, it was a moral declaration, written with the ink of remembrance and the hope of renewal. On that day, the post-WWII world order truly began, rooted in cooperation, not conquest. In 1946, the newly formed United Nations sought a permanent home. After much debate, New York City was chosen, an emblem of modern ambition and international connection. By 1952, the United Nations headquarters rose on the East River, its glass facade reflecting both the skyline and the ideals it represented. The building became more than architecture. It became a symbol of global dialogue. Within its walls, languages intertwined, cultures converged, and diplomacy replaced destruction. Each flag outside stood for sovereignty and unity, reminding the world that even amid differences, peace could be built one conversation at a time.
At the heart of the United Nations lay the Security Council, a council of 15 nations tasked with maintaining global peace. 5 permanent members, America, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union, were given veto power, ensuring their cooperation, but also planting seeds of tension. This structure reflected the fragile balance of the post-World War II world order, power shared yet guarded. Despite its flaws, the Council became the arena where crises were debated, wars prevented, and peacekeeping missions authorized. It stood as the world's conscience, often tested but never replaced. Beyond the Security Council, the General Assembly embodied the democratic soul of the United Nations. Every nation, big or small, had one vote, an unprecedented equality in international politics. In this grand hall, nations that once faced each other on battlefields now sat side by side. The assembly became a stage where new voices rose, where colonies spoke for freedom, and where ideals of justice echoed louder than cannons. Here, the history of the United Nations was written not by empires, but by humanity itself, striving to speak as one global family.
In 1948, under the guidance of Eleanor Roosevelt, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly. It was one of humanity's proudest achievements, a document declaring that every person, regardless of race, religion, or nation, possessed inherent dignity and freedom. The world, scarred by war and genocide, needed moral direction, and the United Nations provided it. This declaration became the heart of the UN Charter's promise, shaping international law and inspiring movements for equality across the globe. As the post-WWII world order took shape, the United Nations faced its first great test, the Cold War. The globe divided into two superpower blocs, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their rivalry often paralyzed the Security Council, each using the veto to protect their interests. Yet, despite ideological battles, the United Nations remained a crucial bridge. Through quiet diplomacy, it prevented confrontations from igniting global war. The UN became both a mirror of tension and a vessel of restraint. In the nuclear age, even when peace trembled, the existence of the United Nations kept humanity talking instead of firing. Out of tension grew innovation. In 1948, the United Nations launched its first peacekeeping mission to monitor a fragile truce in the Middle East. Soldiers wearing blue helmets became global symbols of neutrality and hope. Over time, these missions expanded from Cyprus to the Congo, from Cambodia to Rwanda. The history of the United Nations turned from talk to action, placing men and women between warring sides to protect civilians and uphold peace. Though imperfect and dangerous, these missions embodied the UN's deepest purpose, to stand where humanity itself was breaking. The 1950s and 1960s witnessed the world transforming as former colonies gained independence. The United Nations, 1945, had begun with 51 members, but by the 1970s, it had tripled in size. The General Assembly echoed with new voices from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, demanding equality and development.
The UN became a forum where the newly free could stand beside the old powers as equals. This wave of decolonization reshaped the world map and gave the organization new purpose: to ensure that freedom meant more than flags. It meant dignity, education, and opportunity.
Beyond politics, the United Nations became humanity's lifeline in times of crisis. Through its agencies, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the World Food Program, it reached millions suffering from hunger, disease, and disaster. Vaccines saved children's lives. Food reached famine-stricken villages, and refugee camps became sanctuaries of survival. These efforts embodied the spirit of United Nations Day, celebrating not power, but compassion. While governments argued in chambers, the UN's humanitarian workers stood in the field, where help was needed most. As television and communication expanded, the world began to watch the United Nations in real time. From global summits to emergency sessions, millions saw diplomacy unfold live. The UN Charter promised not only peace, but transparency, and now citizens everywhere could witness it. Civil rights leaders, environmental advocates, and youth delegates began speaking from the same podium where world leaders stood. The UN became more than an institution. It became a stage for humanity's conscience, where the moral battles of the age were fought with words, not weapons. In 1989, the world changed once more. The Berlin Wall, symbol of Cold War division, fell, marking a triumph for diplomacy and freedom. The United Nations celebrated not as a victor, but as a witness to history fulfilled. Decades of dialogue, tension, and peacekeeping had not been in vain. With the Cold War's end, the organization turned toward new missions: rebuilding nations, preventing ethnic wars, and tackling global poverty. The post-World War II world order that began in 1945 had evolved, and the UN's mission had entered a new chapter, one of global cooperation beyond ideology. In the 21st century, the United Nations introduced the Millennium Development Goals, later evolving into the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, a roadmap for humanity's shared future. From eradicating poverty to protecting the planet, these goals united nations in purpose. They reminded the world that the ideals of United Nations 1945 were not relics, but living ambitions. Each October 24, United Nations Day renews this spirit, calling every generation to act, not just to remember peace, but to build it anew. The new millennium brought new challenges. The United Nations faced the test of terrorism, climate change, and global pandemics. From 9/11 to COVID-19, the world once again saw that no nation stood alone. The UN Charter remained the compass guiding humanity through uncertainty. Debates in the General Assembly grew fierce, yet beneath every disagreement lay the same truth. The problems of the 21st century were global, and only global cooperation could solve them. Whether through peacekeeping, health response, or environmental treaties, the United Nations continued to serve as the heart of international solidarity in an age of chaos.
No institution is without flaws. The history of the United Nations is also one of controversy, accusations of bureaucracy, power imbalance, and slow response to crises. Yet, even in criticism lies relevance. The world still turns to the UN in times of conflict and catastrophe. Reform debates continue, aiming to make the organization more transparent and just. The post-World War II world order it built now demands evolution. The United Nations endures not because it is perfect, but because it remains necessary, a stage where the voices of the weak can still reach the powerful, and where humanity's collective conscience refuses to fall silent.
Each year on October 24, the world celebrates United Nations Day, not merely as a commemoration, but as a reminder. From the ashes of 1945 to the digital age of today, the dream of global unity endures. The flags that wave outside UN headquarters tell a story written in struggle, dialogue, and hope. The United Nations 1945 was born from war, yet its purpose has always been peace. Its legacy belongs to every generation that chooses understanding over hatred. As the sun rises over New York each October 24, it shines upon humanity's greatest experiment, the belief that, together, we can still make peace possible.